San Francisco, it's the mecca for tech designers. Home to Silicon Valley, this place pioneered the art of constructing, optimizing, and enhancing a lot of the technology we use every day. It's turbocharged the speed at which we use the internet and made navigating the web more intuitive, but it's also given us a false sense of security. I've lost count of the number of times I've clicked "I agree" to get into a website. We all have to do it. As we speed around the internet, we face hundreds of these annoying pop-ups and consent forms, all demanding a response from us. And yes, I call them annoying because that is exactly what they are. They may look like that they're there to provide us with control, but the reality is far from it.
When users click on "I agree to the terms and conditions," or they see a privacy policy and they click on it, they may think that they're actually being given control of their personal data, what's collected, how it's used. And it's advantageous to companies for them to do that, because if something bad happens, the tech company can then say, "You actually agreed to this." Nobody ever reads the terms of service. No one should ever be expected to. If we actually tried to read every terms and conditions agreement that we came across, it's probably the only thing we would do. It would have to be our day job, because they're so long and we come into so many. It may have the veneer of giving control to data subjects, but ultimately it's window dressing.
Woody Hartzog is what you'd call a scholar of design. He's been studying the psychology, ethics, and legal implications of new technologies. One area he specialises in is data protection and privacy. Now, before we get into this, there's a key term you need to know: informed consent. This is a principle that comes up a lot in discussions of our rights online, but it's easier to explain in the context of medical surgery. A doctor explains potential risks and worst-case scenarios to you, the patient. Once you're fully informed, you have the option to consent to surgery or not. In the online world, though, informed consent is what everyone says is the ideal. But is that even possible?
Consent only works under a very narrow set of conditions, and that's when the decision is infrequent, like with surgery, so we don't have surgery all the time. It's when the risks are visceral. There are things that we can easily conjure up in our minds. And then finally, the harm is possibly great. So if things go wrong with surgery, you could get sick or you could die. So we've got an incredible incentive to take that decision seriously. But of course, none of those things are present in the data ecosystem. We make the decisions quite frequently, 10, 100 times a day. The harms are not visceral at all. They're incredibly opaque. And finally, the harm is not even that great, because the modern privacy harms aren't huge. They're death by 1,000 cuts.
The spin from Silicon Valley is that they're on our side when it comes to how we control our data.
Long privacy policies are very confusing, and if you make it long and spell out all the detail, then you're probably going to reduce the percent of people who read it.
However, take a closer look at the design of the buttons and the pop-ups that we're made to click, and it's clear that the tech companies have the upper hand in the data battle.
Design is power, and every single design decision makes a certain reality more or less likely. And what tech companies and psychologists and other people have known for years is that defaults are notoriously sticky. And so if you design the interface so that all the defaults are set to maximize exposure, then you're going to get a lot more data in the aggregate than you would if you set all the defaults to privacy protective, because people don't go in and change them. So until we fundamentally change the incentives, we're still going to see companies manipulating the design of these buttons and these technologies to ensure that you still keep disclosing data and that they still keep getting what's the lifeblood of their business.
Most of us assume that when we go on a website and click that "I agree" button, the site simply collects information that we voluntarily choose to share. In reality, there are many layers to data collection, and the mechanics of it are invisible, hidden by design. For starters, it isn't just the website you are on that's mining information. There are so-called third parties, advertisers, marketers, and analytics agencies also tracking you. Using tiny bits of software, cookies, beacons, pixel tags, they scoop up incredibly detailed information. Everything from what computer you're using to how long you hover over a link. Honestly, it's a bit mind-boggling. And all you really did was click a button.
And Informed consent is a fundamentally broken regulatory mechanism for algorithmic accountability. It allows companies to continue to throw risk back onto the user and say, here's a pop-up ad, here's a pop-up banner that tells you about cookies that no one reads and nobody really even cares about. Yet we push forward this regime as though it matters to people, as though if someone clicks I agree, then they're magically okay with all the data processing that's going to come afterwards, which is a little bit of a joke. It's a little bit of a legal fiction, yet it's a major component of almost every data protection framework around the world.
Once you've crossed the I agree hurdle, you're now in the clutches of the website. And this is where design takes on a whole new level of importance. The job is to keep you there. One of the most successful innovations in mobile and website design is something called infinite scroll. You know it? We all use it every single day. It's the ability to scroll endlessly through your feeds without ever needing to click. I'm on my way now to meet the creator of this function. His name is Razgan. Now, he no longer works inside big tech corporations. In early 2018, he co-founded the Center for Humane Technology.
All of our apps, all of Silicon Valley companies are competing for our attention. And because it's such a cutthroat game of trying to get our attention, worth tens of billions of dollars, they have to increasingly point more powerful computers at our heads to try to frack us for that attention. I think we've all had that experience of going to YouTube and you think, I'm just gonna watch one video, and then somehow you shake your head and an hour has passed, and how is it that technology has hypnotized us?
This tech hypnotization is key to what's called the attention economy. Our attention is a finite currency in the online world, and it's only as long as websites and apps have our attention that they have our business and our data.
The attention economy is just this. It says if we are not paying for a product, well, the company has to make some money somehow. How do they do it? They do it by selling our attention to advertisers or to other groups that want us to do something. They're trying to make these systems as effective as possible at influencing your decisions. They collect as much information about you as they can, like who your friends are, how you spend your time. Often they'll munge it with how you spend your money. So you take all of this data to build a model of you. Imagine a little simulator of you that lives in the Facebook server. And then they can put things in front of it and be like, are you more likely to click this, this, or this? Oh, if we want to get you to hate immigration, what kind of message? Are you going to resonate with this message or this message? As you can see how it's just this, it begins as just this race for your attention, ends up becoming an entire economy's worth of pressure with the very smartest minds in engineering and the biggest supercomputers trying to make a model of you to be able to influence the kinds of decisions you're going to make.
A few years ago, YouTube set a company-wide objective to reach 1 billion hours of viewing a day. Netflix creator Reed Hastings has also said multiple times that the company's biggest competitor isn't another website, it's sleep. So what happens when you give algorithms the goal of maximizing our attention and time online? They find our weaknesses and exploit them. In 2017, Sean Parker, a founding member of Facebook and its first president, literally confessed to this at an event.
About how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible. And that means that we need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post or whatever. And that's going to get you to contribute more content. It's a social validation feedback loop that it's it's exactly the kind of thing that a hacker like myself would come up with, because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology.
Now, it's not as though Silicon Valley pioneered the tricks and tactics of addiction or persuasive design. Many tech designers openly admit using insights from behavioral scientists of the early 20th century, like the concept of randomly scheduled rewards, studied and developed by American psychologist B.F. Skinner in the 1950s. He created what's become known as the Skinner box, a simple contraption he used to study pigeons and even rats. At the start of the process, a pigeon is given a food reward every time it pecks the word peck, or turns a full circle when the word turn appears. As the experiment proceeds, the rewards become less frequent. They take place at random. But by that time, the behaviour has been established. The pigeon keeps pecking or turning, not knowing when it might get the reward, but in anticipation that a reward could be coming. Skinner boxes were pivotal in demonstrating how design had the power to modify behaviour. And if randomly scheduled rewards worked for pigeons, why not humans? Skinner's concept is in fact at the heart of a lot of addictive design, from casino machines such as slot machines to social media apps. Smartphones are unnervingly similar to slot machines. Think about your Facebook, Instagram, or Pinterest feeds. We all swipe down, pause, and then wait to see what will appear. We're back to those randomly scheduled rewards again. Your swipe could result in a new comment on a photo, a new like, or a piece of spam or software update. We don't really know, and it's that unpredictability that makes it so addictive. Natasha Dalshul is a cultural anthropologist who has spent more than 15 years studying the algorithms behind persuasive design.
Just like on a slot machine, when you're texting or when you are looking through the news feed, you really never know what's coming down the pike. You never know when you're going to sort of hit that jackpot, so to speak, and when it's coming and how much it'll be. So the randomness is very important to keep you hooked in. I think the fact that we're gambling money in a casino isn't really that different than what we're doing because in both cases, what we're really gambling is our attention and our time, right? And across the board, we're sitting there sort of hoping for some little reward to come, never knowing when it's going to come. In all cases, we're sort of sitting alone with the machine. There's no natural stopping point. I think that the similarities are quite striking.
We check our phones over 150 times a day, right? Just like pull it up, pull it up, pull it up. It's the first thing we look at when we wake up. The last thing we look at before we go to sleep. It's like we're glued to it, and that's by design. We now have like over 2 billion Skinner boxes in people's pockets. We are running the largest experiment, like psychological experiment, that the world has ever seen by orders of magnitude, right? 1 out of every 4 human beings on Earth has a Skinner box, which is learning how to uniquely target them. Super fascinating in the abstract, but sort of terrifying when you think about what it's doing.
The research has been done. The evidence is clear that digital technology is being designed with the intention to make us addicts. It's not a secret in the tech industry either. 2 of the biggest tech figures, Bill Gates and the late Steve Jobs, admitted they consciously limited the amount of time their children were allowed to engage with the products they helped create. The problem is real, but the media can often sensationalize the issue of tech addiction and make it harder for us to understand it.
I think that the reason people maybe reach for the metaphor of crack cocaine is because they see that as a sort of high-speed, hyper-intensive form of addiction. And while I don't use that metaphor myself, I do think that within the spectrum of media addictions, there are certain ones that are more high potency, you could say. And those are, if we're going to use the language of addiction, they have a higher event frequency. Think about a horse race, right? You go to the track and you've got to really wait for that event to happen. If you are rapidly engaged in an activity, a Twitter thread, that is more high potency. It has a higher event frequency, which means each event has an opportunity to draw you in more, to reinforce that behavior more. So I think we really can apply the language of addiction to these different media.
I have an ongoing frustration, which is that whenever I am still for a second, I have this impulse to reach into my pocket and pull out my phone, and then I get angry at myself because I say, that's not right. Just enjoy this moment, right? Just be with yourself for a second. And then I get angry at myself that my phone has that much power over me, right? I'm angry that I'm subject to the design of a technology in such a way that I have difficulty sort of resisting its allure. But of course, everything about these technologies is built to create that impulse, to make it feel as though it's irresistible.
There's such emphasis put on free choice and being able to be a consumer, and you make decisions in the marketplace about what you want to do because you have free will. But at the same time, the very people who are promoting that notion of the person as a consumer sovereign are operating and designing their technology with a very different human subject in mind. It's somebody who can, like a rat or a pigeon or any other animal, be incentivized and motivated and hooked in and have their attention redirected. And that's really interesting to me because it is a kind of return to Skinner. I think you wouldn't have heard that in the 80s or 90s. That would have even been creepy to think about someone designing your behavior. But now it's become accepted that you can be a behavior designer.
And behaviour design was one part of what Azza used to do in a previous life. However, he is now one of a growing number of industry insiders who are taking a more critical stance towards these silicon giants. Talking to him left me wondering, does he regret his part in inventing Infinite Scroll?
I want to be humble about it. If I hadn't invented it, it would have been invented. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, thinking about the right kind of thing. But yes, I do regret it. But I do think it talks to the naivety of being oh, here's just a cool feature, and making it, and even if it's great for the individual user, without thinking about the effects that'll happen if you can scale it up to 100 million people or a billion people, where this little thing that I went around to Twitter and Google and all these other companies, they're guys, you should adopt this. Now it's wasted quite literally hundreds of millions of human hours.
I'm sure all of us have had someone or another say to us, stop looking at your phone, or why are you so addicted to social media? And before I started this series, I thought maybe there is something wrong with me. I just had no idea how deliberately designed our online experience is, and how these design algorithms are made to pull us in and form habits. I asked everyone I spoke to, how do we change this? Can we change how online design works?
Regulation cannot be expected to happen on its own within these corporations, right, who are profiting from this, because there's just too deep of a conflict of interest. And so the only viable kind of regulation is going to have to come from the outside. We have to have a public conversation about what is actually going on in these products, how are they working, and once we understand that as a collective, what do we want to limit and constrain?
So if you start with the assumption that people are never going to fully understand the risks of algorithms and the way in which that interacts with data, then we have to think about what else might work in its place. And the data protection regimes like the General Data Protection Regulation are a great foundation. And one of the ways in which we could really improve upon that is to embrace a trust-based model. So instead of putting all the risk on the user, the requirement of protecting people would fall on the company that's using the algorithms, that's using the data. I think there is going to be a huge shift from just human-centered design, as we call it in our field, which is put the human at the center, which was a big movement, to thinking about human protective design, where we say that the tools that we're building are so powerful that they cause real damage to us individually, to our mental health, to our relationships, to our children, and to us societally, to our democracies, to having civil discourse. And that move to human protective design or humane design, I think is super hopeful, because then we can actually have technology which does what it was supposed to in the first place, which is extend our best selves. So if you're concerned about the ways in which data is being collected and algorithms are being used to affect your life, there are 3 things I think you can do. 1, use the tools that are given to you. Use privacy dashboards, use 2-factor authentication, which is really valuable. 2, be more deliberate and critical about the ways in which companies are asking for your information and the devices that you adopt and the services that you participate in. Understand that companies are trying to tell you things through design, and they're trying to make things easier or harder. And think about whether you want things to be easier and what are the costs of making things easier. And understand that companies are trying to get your consent because their entire business depends on it. So think about that as you go forward. And then finally, I think that design and consent and privacy and algorithms need to be a political issue. And so if someone's running for office, ask them what their stance is on algorithmic accountability. Ask them what their stance is on privacy and data collection. Because if we get better rules about how the data is collected and algorithms are used, then we might all be better off.
We're at this inflection point where our technology is beginning to make predictions about us that are better than the predictions we make about ourselves. And so one of the best ways of inoculating it is by learning about ourselves more. Just like stop and really ask yourself, like before you post something to Facebook or Instagram, like why am I doing this? Like what are my motivations? If you sort of like slow down your thought process, often I found that it'll be like, oh, I am pulling this app out because I'm a little bit bored, or everyone else just pulled out their phone, so I'm feeling a little socially awkward. Oh, that's curious. Or maybe like I'm having this experience and I sort of want to show off just a little bit. And just like stopping and thinking about like what are my motivations for doing things, I found to be a great inoculation for spending my time in ways that I wish I had later.
I'll just say that I recommend having a general attitude shift where you understand yourself as an organism, as a creature that can, like any other number of creatures and animals, be turned in certain directions, have your attention swayed, caught, captured, hooked. I find it liberating to recognize all of the forces that are exerting these different powers on me to turn my attention in one way or another. And somehow realizing that helps me to disconnect a lot because it makes me a little bit angry. And I don't feel so bad about myself. I feel bad about what's being done to me, and then I'm more able to disconnect.